Hello folks, it's Pheelan back here on a beautiful Sunday morning. I thought I would do a little podcast today about the restoration of truth and what the Reformers did for the church. You know, truth always has to be restored, because in each generation you have false doctrines vying with and trying to supplant the truth. It's something that we accept as a given. It's something that we learn to live with. But it always has to be done from within the fold. In other words, you can't have Christians, you can't have ex-Christians, or you can't have apostates from without the church trying to dictate to Christians what is truth and what isn't. It has to be done within the church. Nowadays, you have a lot of people who listens to false Christians or non-Christians, ex-Christians, whatever, and have gone running after them. They no longer listen to those who know the truth and who teach the truth. It's a little bit of a problem, isn't it? You know, the Reformers, what they did was they basically restored truth that had gotten clouded over, that had gotten dirtied after a time. And the Roman Catholic Church didn't just pop up out of nowhere. The doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, more progressive than anything else, so it took several centuries for the Roman Catholic Church to become what it is today. One of the first things that they restored was the doctrine of imputed righteousness, very important. Another thing that they restored was the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement, two of the most important doctrines in the Word of God. The sacraments as well. They spent a lot of time on talking about the
sacraments.
And of course, there are varying degrees of clarity among them as to the meaning and the application of the sacraments. But I think that the most important thing they did was clear away the doctrine of transubstantiation, which is more based on Aristotle's physics than it is on the Word of God. Of course, you have Luther's consubstantiation as well, and that had to be cleared away. But the Augustinian doctrines of grace, that's another thing that they brought to the forefront when they began to restore the truth. Of course, it took a couple hundred years or more for some of the doctrines to become restored. What about the Jews? What about their promises God made to them? Do those all fall to the ground? Well, during the 19th century, men began to answer no. And of course, there were several reformers who believed in a future salvation of Israel, but it didn't happen really until the 19th century, to the Great Awakening, and then beyond that men began to realize that the promises that God made to Israel must still hold good, and that there will be a future salvation of Israel. So it took a couple hundred years for these things to come about, and then of course you had academic backlash against the more conservative doctrines. So you had Tractarianism, the Oxford movement, Puseyism, whatever you like to call it, happening at the same time as these great revivals were taking place. And of course you have preterism as well, stepping in through the teachings of Moses Stewart and Samuel Lee and others, to try to dampen the doctrines, the sharpness and clarity of some of these doctrines that were now being restored for the first time, the second coming of Christ being one of them. So you have doctrines of the pulpit vying with doctrines of the pew. You have the pulpit has always said that, well, this is the truth, and that all these men had it wrong, and the pew, of course, wants the plain, unadulterated Word of God. This has always been a trend, especially
from the 1950s onward.
Academia began to replace the ministry in its sending forth men to minister for the work. Truth always has to be restored, because, like I said, in each generation you have false doctrines vying with and trying to supplant the truth. Restorationism, we don't want to go that far, do we? Because that's really teaches a failed Messiah, that Jesus Christ couldn't establish his truth in the world until several hundred, almost 2,000 years after the fact. So we don't want to go that far, but what we want to do is use correction by standard, as R.H. Malden once said, correction by standard, that standard being the Word of God, and that's what the Reformers did. And then, of course, to do it from within the fold, from within the church, rather than from without the fold, is another ingredient. The end result of restoration of truth is that it harmonizes with 2,000 years of Christian teaching, and it vindicates God's providence over his church. So it harmonizes with 2,000 years. In other words, it doesn't lead to the view that everybody else was wrong, one person was right. It's a communal sort of understanding of the truth, and it also vindicates God's providence, meaning that God did exercise providence over his church, that he did lead men into the truth, and that he did preserve the true gospel for 2,000 years. That's about all I have today. Just figured I would drop in with that quick little primer, and hopefully I can get something else going this week. Some time constraints going on nowadays, but hopefully we'll get some more going, and we'll talk some more about the doctrines of full preterism. Until then, have yourself a great, beautiful, blessed Sabbath, and I'll talk to you soon.